I have my earphones in. My phone's over there though, it's on vibrate.
So everybody text him.
Hopefully, hopefully mom won't call 5 times like she did last week. At least you guys didn't hear it, because the ringing was in my ear and I kept thinking, just read, Dave, just read, pretend like it's nothing. And, you know, the funny thing is, I call her and I said, Mom, you called me 5 times. You did? Yeah, Mom, I could hear you on the answering machine. You were trying to figure out what button you pushed, but you had me on the answer. She just, But at least she's calling, right?
That's right.
At least she's calling.
Hey Dave, I do that, and I'm not 90.
Now, I do remind her, I said, you know, Hunter, you have a lot of passes here. In California, I don't know how many of you have ever visited the Great Redwood Forest. They're called giant sequoias, part of the redwood family, and they can live, these trees, for more than 3,000 years. That's only what we have recorded.
Yeah.
A lot of trees have reached documented 5,000 years old. Trees are the longest living organism known to mankind. And as I did some research on it this morning, I was shocked. There is a tree, I'm trying to remember where it's called, Rondo or Hondo, Pando is what it's called. And it is one tree over about 300 acres. And they're predicting that it's probably about 13,000 years old. So we have just think, dinosaurs roamed, they roamed, if you believe in dinosaurs. Either way, they were here, some of these trees out in California when Christ arose from the grave. And I can remember visiting when I was a kid, the Great Redwood Forest. I was about 12 or 13. My dad took us across country camping, and we came down through the Redwood Forest, and it was amazing. We drove our car through a redwood tree. I looked at another one, had an apartment in it. I was shocked at the size of these trees. Fond memories. They say that their branches reach over 300 feet toward the clouds, and the problem started a few years ago amid a record drought. Scientists noticed something odd, and some of these sequoias, these behemoths, these huge trees, especially in Kings Canyon National Parks, they were dying in ways that they had never had or understood or documented. And they were dying from the top down. So they had researchers, and they climbed up into the canopies of the trees, and they discovered a small cedar bark beetle. And these beetles had bored into just a few branches, and by 2019, they said about 38, 40 of these trees had died, again, from the top down. And it was concerning because they'd never observed anything like that. And says Christy Brigham, the park's chief resource management at the time, she says, beetles have ravaged hundreds of millions of pine trees, but never the great redwoods. A tiny beetle you could crush under your foot. It ate right through the bark and devoured the heart of the tree. The deadliest animal known to man. Some of you know the answer to this. It's not a creature that we usually find scary, like a lion or a snake. Mosquitoes, by far, are the deadliest creature in the world when it comes to annual human deaths. It causes about 1 million deaths per year, compared to about 100,000 deaths from snakes and about 250 deaths from lions. Small things, common things, accepted things are often the most deadly. So we have to be careful of little things, little attitudes, because if you practice them long enough, they become part of you. They begin to define you. Little indulgences. But if you give them place long enough in your life, they begin to desensitize you to sin. Habits form, addictions form. Little wrong thoughts. Not big, just small. But if you keep dwelling on them, they pretty much convince you they're true. And that every other thought that other people have is wrong. And you're right. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 5:6, do you know that a little yeast works through the whole batch of dough? A little yeast. Jesus gave the same type of warning to his disciples in Mark chapter 8, verses 11 to 21. We've actually covered this passage for the last few weeks. But I wanted to address it again because of how Jesus responds to the disciples. Let me read it first. Jesus, if you remember, he had just fed 4,000 people. They got in the boat. They go to the other side of the lake. And as soon as they get to the other side of the lake, he's confronted. We'll pick up there. The Pharisees came and began to question Jesus to test him. They asked him for a sign from heaven. And he sighed deeply and said, why does this generation ask for a sign? Truly, I tell you, no sign will be given to you. Then he left them, got back into the boat, and crossed the other side. The disciples had forgotten to bring bread, except one loaf they had with them in the boat. Be careful, Jesus warned them. Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod. They discussed with one another and said, it is because we have no bread. Aware of their discussion, Jesus asked them, why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not see or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes but fail to see and ears but fail to hear? And don't you remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000? How many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up? 12, they replied. And when I broke the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up? They answered, 7. And he said to them, do you still not understand? Now let's settle on verse 15, which says, be careful. Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod. The whole passage started in verse 11, and it started the disciples talking about not having enough food. And let's review some facts, just to make sure we have the proper context. Jesus had, like I said, just got done feeding 4,000 people with 7 loaves and a few fish, and just a couple months before that, he had fed over 5,000 men, and that's not including women and children, so we estimate probably somewhere around 20,000, 25,000 people with 5 loaves and a few fish. Meanwhile, during that time, he was constantly teaching. He was continually healing people of all kinds of illnesses, disability, casting out spiritual forces, demonic forces in their life. Miracle after miracle had been occurring the whole entire time. After 3 days, this huge crowd of 4,000, Jesus says goodbye, and his disciples get into a boat, and they go to the other side of the lake or the sea. And I'm sure it would take them a while to get there. And as soon as they arrived on the other side, immediately they encountered some religious leaders who sought Jesus out, not to ask him questions and wonder who he was. It says in Scripture, to test him. They were there for a purpose, to pin Jesus down. And they questioned him, and obviously Jesus was creating a stir. Jesus addressed them quickly, and then they all got in the back of the boat and took off again for who knows where. I'm sure he'd had enough of these Pharisees. That was one of the probably reasons that he went into Gentile territory in the beginning. Now there's only 1 loaf of bread in the boat and more than a dozen people on board. And the Bible says that the disciples had forgotten to stock up on all those basketfuls that they had collected. But somebody had the sense to bring 1 loaf with them. We sit there and we go, why? Why would they not bring some of those baskets with them? I think it's just like any other ordinary event. People forget things. But to Jesus, for some reason, it wasn't just like any other event. But Jesus saw a potential danger, and he gave a warning to his disciples. So what Jesus was concerned about wasn't a lack of food, it was the way they think. Remember that this was his words after his brief encounter with these leaders, and interesting in the past experiences that Jesus had had with them and with people in front of them, all the miracles they'd observed, it didn't change their perspective on things and on Jesus. So Jesus, and it really did have an impact on the disciples, yes, we say, but at the same time, why are they thinking about this bread? And so Jesus needs to remind them of his miracles of feeding the crowds. And I don't think the problem was their loss of memory. It had to do with what Jesus was talking about, the yeast of the Pharisees and of Herod, which meant what? Well, yeast, 11, is a powerful, essentially fungus that causes a lump of dough to rise, and you don't need much at all. Those of you that bake, you understand that. If you bake bread, you got to have a little bit, you got to have a lot of dough and just a little bit of yeast. That's all it takes. Very small amount, and it can cause a huge change. And the word is often used in the Bible when it describes corruption or evil. It was not just yeast, but the yeast of the Pharisees. Jesus was referring to the corrupting influence of the Pharisees' thinking. Now, what kind of influence was he talking about? One word: unbelief. Unbelief. The disciples didn't suffer a loss of memory. It wasn't that they couldn't recall the miracles that Jesus had just experienced with Christ. They remembered, they knew, but they couldn't understand. They had eyes to see, but they couldn't see. They had ears to hear, but they couldn't hear. Despite what they had gone through, here they are, worried that they didn't have enough bread in the boat. And that's why Jesus responded the way he did. And I could just see him, why are you talking about bread, guys? That's a non-issue here. Do you not remember what I just did? We got one whole loaf here. 12 people. Duh. I want to, how frustrating must he have been? The problem wasn't with the bread, it was with their unbelieving mindset. They were acting and thinking like the Pharisees that Jesus had just talked to, so Jesus warned them to be careful, to not let the ways and the attitudes of the Pharisees corrupt their minds and hearts. Jesus and the disciples had just left. Thousands they fed, traveled across this great lake, landed in Jewish territory. The Pharisees had been there waiting for him, ready to debate and argument. They demanded for Jesus to perform this miraculous sign from heaven to prove that he was the great I am. And I guess feeding thousands with virtually no food didn't count. I guess healing hundreds didn't really count. I guess casting demons out, which they readily agreed with, didn't count. Day in and day out, he's doing these things, but that doesn't count to them. We need a real sign, they said. So what were they looking for exactly? The sun to keep shining all day and all night? That had happened. The dead to come back to life? That actually happened too. Although, before this point, I don't think Lazarus had been raised from the dead yet. But they'll get that sign. Lightning to come from the sky and hit precisely where they indicate. Well, Elijah did that, but, maybe they want to see Jesus do it too. Did they want to see the sea part? Everybody cross over on dry land? And Moses did that. Can you do that, Jesus? I mean, what were they looking for exactly? They didn't want a sign. All those signs had already been given, and more. But they didn't want a sign. They just wanted Jesus dead. At that point, it didn't matter what Jesus did. They wouldn't believe because they had already made up their minds. Their mindset was one of unbelief. Remember, Mark said in chapter 8, the Pharisees came and began to question Jesus to test him. They asked him for a sign from heaven. He sighed deeply and said, why does this generation ask for a miraculous sign? To tell you the truth, no sign will be given to it. The Pharisees, I'm sure, have been following. They saw the miracles. They knew thousands had been fed, yet they refused to believe. It wasn't their desire to know more about Jesus. I think Mark puts it straight to us that they were there to test him. They had an attitude to believe, and they were there to trap him. The truth was, no matter what Jesus did, it would never be enough to convince them that he was Christ. They would always find a way to impeach his credibility. When he cast out demons, they said it was from the devil's power that he did it. When he healed people in the temple, the Pharisees complained that he had broken the Sabbath. And so it didn't matter what Jesus had done, what he was going to do to them. He was a lawbreaker, and a lawbreaker could never be the Messiah. But it was so much deeper than even that. They had somewhere given into a small seed of wrong thinking. Maybe it wasn't really bad. Maybe just a little bit, is this guy really the Messiah? I heard about him. Is he really? But somewhere along the line, they allowed it to take root. And they continued and they accepted it. And eventually, they were controlled by it. And the evil one had impregnated them with a small wrong thought, a small suggestion. And knowing human nature, being an expert on human nature, he knew that it would take on a life of its own. So he sowed a thought, it took root and grew. And it reaped actions. Small things left alone, never attended to, over time become big things. Small thoughts left alone, never challenged, over time become dominant thinking. I'm sure Jesus, when he looked at those religious leaders, he was disappointed. They should have known better, if anyone should have. But they were hardened, and they were spiritually blind. And they showed a great disbelief in their hearts and minds. I thought about it. Real faith doesn't ask for signs like that. And it only shows us that those Pharisees had fully refused to put their trust in Christ. And it was their choice. It always has been and always will be a choice. We choose to believe in God and Jesus Christ. Or we choose to reject Jesus Christ. And let's be clear. If you're sitting on the fence, you chose to not believe in Jesus Christ. Some of you might have seen the little Instagram post where this guy talks about a dream that he had, and a man walks up to a fence. On one side is the devil in hell, on the other side is Jesus in heaven. And this guy's sitting on the fence, and the devil walks up to him and says, "Why don't you come on my side?" And he says, "No." He goes, "I definitely don't want to go on your side." And Jesus says, "Why don't you come on my side?" And he says, "Well," he goes, "I still haven't made up my mind, so I can't come to your side yet." And they both turn and walk away, and just then the devil stops and he turns and he walks back to the man at the fence. He goes, "You come with me." He goes, "What?" He goes, "I own the fence." People have already made up their minds. These Pharisees had already made up their minds, and it didn't matter at that point what Jesus did. They were not going to believe. And the ordinary folks, well, they showed greater faith. Mark in 7:37, it says that people were overwhelmed with amazement that he had done everything well. He even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak. Constantly throughout Scripture, that's what I see, is that people swarmed to Jesus and many believed. Now, were the disciples sitting in the boat showing a similar attitude? Yes. And Jesus didn't want to take root, so he challenged them when it was a small thought. Unfortunately, with one it didn't take, and Judas betrayed him. Did Jesus know he would? Yes. And I don't know about you, but when I think about Judas, it's pretty overwhelming to me that Jesus looked at him, knew he would betray him, and yet still loved him and chose him. How do you do that? And yet he did. Knowing that they would choose wrong, and yet you still love them. I can't comprehend that kind of love. And it only comes from God. He's the only one who is able to love someone that hates him fully. So at that point, Jesus challenged their small thought so it doesn't become a big thinking. And it called for a warning from Jesus. The disciples had seen people fed, walked, healed. They saw it all, and they were talking about now in the boat not having enough bread. Really? So Jesus warned them, watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and of Herod. In other words, beware of the little things, the unbelieving, the doubting, the worldly thoughts of man. Don't be influenced by these unbelieving ways and attitudes. Don't be infected with unbelief, choosing to believe everything only you can understand from your limited perspective. And we do that too, unfortunately. We do that too, and when we do it, we write off what God can do in our lives. In verse 17, he says, do you still not see or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you not have eyes? Do you have eyes but fail to see, and ears but fail to hear? And don't you remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up? Do you not still understand, guys? In other words, don't lose your senses. We shouldn't lose our senses. We need to see and feel and hear spiritually. Don't lose your spiritual sense. I think Jesus is saying to them and us. Have you not seen his work lately? Why haven't you seen his work lately? Why haven't we seen his work lately? Do we not hear what he said? Like yeast in a dough, a little lack of faith can permeate one's life, and it can break out into an open rebellion against God. I'm sure a lot of people that have walked away from God and maybe even don't even like Christianity anymore. If we go back, it was sown with a little thought. The disciples missed it the first time around. They failed to understand the significance of the 5,000. Now they were missing it a second time. Jesus had a concern about the condition of his followers, and he was concerned with ours too. And he reminds us he uses all kinds of ways to do that with us. His word, other people, situations, events, trials. His reminders are all around us if we're keyed into his voice. The problem is so many Christians need hearing aids. It's not that Christ isn't speaking, it's that we've wandered so far from him that we have a hard time hearing what he's saying. And we miss so much of him. And we also miss his peace, his hope. We don't feel His love, His acceptance. We could sing the worship songs, but the words don't resonate in our hearts. We miss His blessings. Not that they're not there, but because we can't see them, we can't hear them, and therefore we don't experience them. And it's all about faith. Don't let the yeast of unbelief gain a foothold. Break down our trust in God. Mark Twain, we all know Mark Twain. We love his stories. Clarence McCartney wrote about the unbelief of Mark Twain. I didn't know this about him. Mark Twain was one of the best-known American authors and humorists. His real name is, I didn't know this either, Samuel Langhorne Clemens. I can make fun of that name. And he's best known for his novels. We all remember The Adventures of Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn, two of my favorites when I was a kid. Mark Twain was married to Olivia Langdon. She was a simple but devout Christian, a believer, but he was not a believer. And for a while they were married, they had prayer at meals. She prayed, and they read the Bible each day, which she read. But soon after they were married, they apparently gave that up. And according to a conversation she had with her sister, Olivia said that she had given up on a lot of her religious beliefs. Her faith was shaken by people, places, and philosophies in which she was exposed to as she traveled the world with her husband. Olivia's pet name for her husband was Youth. Their only son, Langdon, died in infancy, and two of their three daughters, Susie and Jean, died as young women. And during one of those sad times in their lives, it could have been the death of one of their children, I don't know. But Twain, he said to his wife, who he called Livy, if it comforts you to lean on the Christian faith, do so. And she said back, quote, but I can't, Youth. I haven't any. Twain, it said, felt responsible for causing Livy to lose her faith, and thought apparently came back many times to haunt him before his death in 1904. Apparently he loved his wife dearly and devotedly, but apparently his unbelieving attitude had such an effect on her that it made his life miserable and hers as well. I'm just going by what I read. I don't know if that's true or not. I can't imagine that it's false. I have seen couples go through many similar struggles when one party does not know Christ and the other does. And some of them were once very faithful followers of Jesus Christ. They came to church, they came to Bible studies, they talked about God easily, they shared their faith easily. But I watched a lot of them become influenced by their spouse and they drifted away. Now, while that's true, I've seen the opposite take effect. Jean and Yolanda, I think I've shared this story before. They came to me for premarital counseling because I knew Jean's brother and rather sister and brother-in-law. And I knew that Jean and Yolanda weren't Christians. I knew that his sister and brother-in-law were. That's how I knew them. And so they came to me, and the very first time I had them sit in my office, and I figured, just let me share my story with you. And I just shared my simple story of how I came to trust Christ. And I was not even done yet. I wasn't even done. And Jean said, and Jean was the most interested in this Christian thing because of the impact of his sister. And he said, can we do that too, Dave? I was speechless. And so I said, sure, you can. And Yolanda says, I'd like to do that as well. Not because of Jean's faith, which she already had at the time, but because of mine. And I said, sure, right, let's have in a prayer. We had both firecrackers, and nothing dramatic happened. It was just, hey, thanks for the time, we'll see you. And 3 years later, I get a note from Gene. I thought it was a really cool thing. I left, had no idea how it was going to go, did the wedding, I haven't seen him since. And I wasn't expecting anything. That's happened lots of times. And here 3 years later, I get a note from Gene, and he said, I don't think we've ever thanked you, Dave, of that day in your office when we asked Jesus Christ into our lives. Our lives have never been the same. It has dramatically changed us. Jesus has changed us. And we thank you so much for allowing God to use you that day. And to me, that pointed to a lot of maturity. He wasn't me. He understood it was God using me. I only reaped what his sister-in-law had sowed. Gene affected Yolanda. Both Gene and Yolanda were affected by the sister and brother-in-law. They spent their time and gave their attention to light, and as a result, darkness didn't have a chance. I watched half of my ministry years, or I worked half my ministry years with teens and people in their 20s to 40s, and most of them were single. And I have watched so many, some of them very dear to me, walk away from Jesus. And the thing is, I know they believe, but I watched them walk away from making Jesus first in their lives. And I watched them walk into some thinking that was small in the beginning and now has taken root of their lives. I have a friend not far away. Most of you would know him. And he loved Jesus. It was an inspiration to be with him because it was just a matter of seconds before he started talking about him. I don't know if he ever talks about him anymore. I know he definitely doesn't value the things that Jesus values. And why? What happened? Why did that take place? Well, a little heart was sown, it was nurtured, it was comforted, and then he stepped away from those things that kept him close to Jesus. It happened slowly, but he cooled his relationship with them personally. He stopped going to church. He didn't come to Bible studies. He stopped hanging out with his friends who were believers and were close to Jesus and whose intimacy stimulated him to follow Jesus. And instead, he developed friendships with this other type of thinking, and that began to dominate him. And their thinking and behavior became his. And it was a slow thing, but thoughts were sown, and he started to associate more and more with those who encouraged that thinking. And he got up with that life, and he began to love the world just too much, and he drifted from Jesus. And my prayer, whenever I think about it, is that, Lord, bring him back. And I hope one day that will come. And some eventually do come back, some don't. And we wonder, did they ever know Christ in the first place? Or did they somewhere along the line choose to reject him? It's easier to pull someone up than down. That's why Jesus had to say, be careful. Not many of us here are struggling to believe in him, and I think that applies to most of us here. Maybe I'm wrong, but just in case, if you're out there and you're looking for signs so that you can trust him, that day probably will never come because he doesn't deal with the signs, he deals with the faith. And if you have the faith to pray for a sign, I'm sure you're going to see it when it does come, but it's not going to be dramatic. It's going to be that still small voice in your heart that causes you to see the movement of God and know that's him speaking. Jesus rather in John chapter 20, verses 30-31, Jesus did many other miraculous signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book, John says. But these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. So we have to ask ourselves, have our hearts grown hardened or softened to Jesus over the years? Maybe we've been praying for things and it just doesn't seem to be happening the way that we think it should. And we doubt. And that can get us to start questioning. And it takes faith to believe God has heard us and is working even though we don't see anything happening. Jesus said that he came to give us life and to give us a life of abundance. That we can truly know his abundance. And what he was speaking of, if we decide to put our full trust in Jesus Christ, even when we don't see the thing happening that we want to happen. We take him at his word, and we leave the results in his lap. That sounds hard, but that's where faith comes in. On the corner of Roe Park and Beacon Street, New York City, where Horace Greeley's statue now stands, there was a man that stood there many years ago, and he offered $20 gold pieces for $1 a piece. And all day he kept loudly talking about what he was selling, and people kept walking by him. Thousands passed him by. Most paid no attention. Some laughed and made fun of him as they went by. And about 15 minutes before 6 o'clock, when he was about to quit, a woman apparently timidly walked up to him and carefully looked at the piece. She investigated it. She bit it. She tested it. She threw it even onto the pavement. And reluctantly, she gave the guy $1 for this golden double eagle coin. And the man said about 10-15 minutes later, just as he was packing up to leave, the woman reappeared, and she was accompanied by 2 friends. And in between them, he said that they purchased my whole stock, worth $160 at the time. This was a lot of years ago. And they bought it all for $8. The next, and for several following mornings, apparently the street was crowded for blocks with the same woman in the lead waiting for the vendor of the gold coins. But he never appeared again. And this is a story known to be true. And Horace Greeley is responsible for the incident in demonstration of his theory that most poverty is due to the fact that the general public refuses to believe, even in the face of overwhelming evidence. And there is the point. We have overwhelming evidence of who Jesus was historically. We have overwhelming evidence of who Jesus was spiritually. The question is the same one that the disciples were faced with. Will we believe you at your word? Or will we allow the yeast of the Pharisees to seep into our hearts and begin to munch and eat that thought? It will become dominant in our thinking. Small things have a way of doing that. They kill big redwood trees, and they kill great lives. So what do? Well, I think 3 things as I close. Number 1, build your faith upon his word. Don't go around looking for signs or basing your belief on your emotions that you might feel. A lot of us do that. I'm not saying don't feel. I'm not saying don't enjoy the emotions. But we can't base our faith on that. That's not faith. That's just having a good time. That's our limited perspective, in essence. That's not believing God at His word, and that's what we got to do. Believe God at His word. Live by faith at His word. Number 2, take more notice of what God is doing, not what the devil's doing. Satan has not been removed. We might see his works, we read about him every day in the paper, and that can overwhelm us. And what it does is it causes us to dwell on what he's doing and not on what God is doing. It should not bother us because victory is assured. We've already told you God's already won. The devil, he's doing everything he can to hurt God. He's doing everything he can to hurt us because God loves us. So why focus on his works? Look at what God is doing around us. Have eyes to see, have ears to hear, and get excited about what he's doing. Yeah, we only see small stories every now and then in the news, but they're out there. Even in our own lives, God is working. So we have to be tuned in to what he's doing. And a big part of that is being close to him. Knowing his voice. Jesus said, I come from my sheep, and my sheep will hear my voice. Trust him even when you can't see what he's doing, and encourage other people to do the same, other believers to do the same. And the third thing is make sure you encircle yourself with others who love Jesus. That's the great thing about a real church, and real Bible studies, and real Christian friends who are really seeking Jesus Christ. Their desire for him becomes contagious in your life. Their mere presence ignites your own heart. It reminds you of him. It reminds you of his word. It stimulates you to seek him. And if you don't have friends like that, find some. Start hanging around them. Start being close to them. Not a good conversation, if that's okay. Let them talk. Ask them about their Christian life. Ask them their testimony. And you know what gets a nominal Christian really excited about Jesus? When somebody asks them the reason of the hope that they have inside. It reminds them again of what the power of God in their lives has done. Be around them. Their thinking, although small, it's going to start seeping into your own. It's why Jesus warned the disciples, beware, be careful. Nurture a sinking heart. Feed it. Stay that way. It needs to be continually fed. Do you realize that? Our heart of belief needs to be continually fed. By his word, by trusting him in his word, by seeking others who are in the same journey. And I'm not saying don't be friends with people that aren't. I'm just saying be careful and watch your time with that. And make sure you're around people that love Jesus. And the truth is, the more you fall in love with Jesus, the more you're going to want to share that love. And it's going to draw you to Bible studies. It's going to draw you to church. It's going to draw you to people that also love Jesus. You can't help it. But how many other people will be impacted when that takes place in our hearts? Because many of those friends who are out there, who are nominal, who aren't believers, they just need to watch Jesus in our life. Jesus reminded us that it's his presence that changes anything. He reminded us in the song that we sang that your forgiveness, it's whole, it's full. He says, don't dwell on the past. That's what we just sang. Focus on what's going to happen in the future. Focus on the good things that God has done and will do in your lives. Focus on the fact that he can use you above and beyond your imagination or dreams to change the eternal lives of other people. How cool is that? That he can even use us. So be aware. Be aware of the yeast of the world. Don't let it seep in. Don't let it become a big thing. While it's small right now, nip it in the bud. In Jesus' Jesus reminds us it's why we celebrate communion each and every week, to remind us. Nip that thought. Nip that thought. Keep Jesus first and foremost. Make your relationship with him fresh. As we celebrate communion together, let's think about where we are in our relationship.